America on edge, the war that turned inward. It began with urgency. It unfolded with certainty. And now, just weeks later, it is unraveling into something far more unpredictable. A conflict that was framed as decisive, strategic, even necessary, is rapidly transforming into a political and economic storm inside the United States. Not months from now, not years down the line, but immediately, within barely 60 days, across the country, a quiet but unmistakable shift is taking place. The language has changed, the tone has hardened, and the question that once lingered at the margins is now front and center. What exactly is this war achieving? Behind the official statements and carefully worded briefings, a different reality is taking shape. One defined not by victory but by uncertainty, not by unity but by fracture. The conflict with Iran, once presented as a show of strength, is now exposing something far more fragile. The limits of public patience in an era where every consequence is felt in real time. The administration insists that hostilities have ceased. A ceasefire was announced. The language suggests closure, resolution, control. But outside the corridors of power, that narrative is failing to hold. Because for millions of Americans, nothing feels resolved. Gas prices continue to rise. Inflation tightens its grip. Daily life grows more expensive, more unpredictable, and the connection between those pressures and the conflict abroad is no longer abstract. It is direct, immediate, and impossible to ignore. This is not how modern wars used to unfold. There was a time when distance softened the impact, when the costs were delayed, filtered, obscured by time and narrative. That distance is gone. Now the consequences arrive instantly, and with them doubt. The numbers alone are enough to fuel that doubt. Estimates suggest that maintaining the conflict has cost more than $500 million per day. It is a figure that resonates not because of its scale, but because of what it represents. A daily outflow of resources in a country where millions are already struggling to keep up with rising costs. Critics have seized on that figure, transforming it into a symbol of misplaced priorities. They draw stark comparisons. They speak of what that money could fund domestically: healthcare, infrastructure, wages. The argument is not subtle. It is designed to provoke, to unsettle, to force a reckoning. Supporters of the conflict push back just as forcefully. They argue that the threat posed by Iran is real, immediate, and potentially catastrophic. They point to nuclear ambitions, to decades of hostility, to the risks of inaction. In their view, the cost of doing nothing would be far greater. But even within that defense, a tension is emerging, because the justification, while urgent, remains incomplete. If the objective was to dismantle Iran's nuclear capabilities, that has not been achieved. If the goal was to weaken the regime, it remains firmly in place. If the intention was to deliver a decisive blow, the outcome appears anything but decisive. And that gap between expectation and reality is where public support begins to erode. Inside political debates, the fractures are becoming impossible to ignore. What makes this moment particularly volatile is not just the criticism itself, but where it is coming from. It is not confined to one party. It is not limited to ideological opponents. Voices from across the political spectrum are raising similar concerns. Republicans question the strategy. Democrats challenge the execution. Independents express growing unease. This convergence is rare, and it carries weight, because in a deeply polarized political environment, agreement across party lines often signals something deeper than routine disagreement. It signals a fundamental lack of confidence. At the center of the storm is a question that no administration can afford to leave unanswered. Has the war been justified to the American people? So far, the answer appears to be no. And in a democracy, that answer has consequences. The debates themselves have taken on a sharper, more confrontational tone. Accusations fly freely. Some claim the administration has bypassed Congress, stretching executive authority to its limits. Others argue that previous policy decisions set the stage for this very conflict, pointing to the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. the nuclear agreement that once sought to limit Iran's capabilities. That agreement remains a flashpoint. Supporters argue it was flawed, temporary, insufficient. Critics counter that it provided structure, oversight, and a path away from escalation. Its absence, they say, created a vacuum, one that has now been filled by conflict. The argument is not merely about the past. It is about causality, about whether this war was inevitable or whether it was the result of choices that could have been made differently. There is no consensus, only escalation. Meanwhile, outside the political arena, the economic pressure continues to build. For many Americans, the war is not experienced through briefings or policy papers. It is experienced through receipts, bills, and daily expenses. The price of fuel becomes a political statement. The cost of groceries becomes a measure of leadership. And as those costs rise, patience declines. This is where the conflict takes on a new dimension. It is no longer just a foreign policy issue. It becomes domestic, personal, immediate. The administration faces a delicate balancing act. On one hand, it must maintain the narrative of strength and necessity. On the other, it must respond to a public that is increasingly skeptical, increasingly strained, and increasingly unwilling to accept vague assurances. The danger lies in underestimating that shift, because public opinion does not collapse all at once. It erodes, gradually, then suddenly. A series of small doubts coalesce into a broader loss of confidence. And once that threshold is crossed, regaining support becomes exponentially more difficult. History offers lessons, but they are not exact parallels. Every conflict unfolds in its own context. Every administration faces its own constraints. But one pattern remains consistent. Wars that lack clear objectives and visible progress tend to lose public backing. Not always immediately, but inevitably. What makes this moment different is the speed. 60 days. That is all it has taken for the conversation to shift from justification to skepticism, from urgency to fatigue, from support to pressure, and that speed changes everything, because it compresses the timeline. It forces decisions sooner. It intensifies pressure. It leaves less room for strategic ambiguity, less tolerance for delayed outcomes. The administration's assertion that the war is effectively over does little to ease that pressure. If anything, it raises new questions. If the conflict has ended, why do the consequences persist? Why do the costs remain? Why does the situation feel unresolved? These are not rhetorical questions. They are political liabilities. Opponents have begun to frame the conflict in stark terms, not as a necessary intervention, but as an avoidable mistake. They highlight the lack of tangible results. They emphasize the economic strain. They question the decision-making process. Supporters, in turn, warn against complacency. They argue that threats do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. That leadership requires difficult choices. That security demands sacrifice. The clash between these perspectives is intensifying, and at its core lies a deeper tension. The gap between strategic necessity and public consent. A government may believe a conflict is justified. It may have intelligence, analysis, and long-term calculations to support that belief. But without public buy-in, that justification becomes increasingly fragile. Because wars are not sustained by strategy alone. They are sustained by belief. Right now, that belief is weakening, not collapsing, not disappearing, but shifting in ways that are difficult to reverse. The implications extend beyond this single conflict. They speak to a broader transformation in how wars are perceived, debated, and ultimately supported in the modern era. The threshold for acceptance is higher. The tolerance for ambiguity is lower. The demand for clarity is immediate. And when those expectations are not met, the response is swift. That is the reality now confronting the administration. A war that was meant to project control is now exposing vulnerability, not on the battlefield, but in the court of public opinion. Not in distant territory, but at home. The question is no longer whether the conflict was necessary. It is whether it can be sustained politically, economically, and socially in its current form. Because even if the fighting has paused, The fallout has not. It continues to unfold in conversations, in debates, in rising costs and growing doubts. It continues to shape perceptions, to influence narratives, to redefine priorities. And it is doing so at a pace that leaves little room for correction. There is still time to reshape the narrative, to clarify objectives, to address concerns, to rebuild confidence. But that window is narrowing, and with each passing day, the cost of inaction grows, not just in dollars, but in trust. In the end, the most dangerous aspect of this moment may not be the conflict itself, but the uncertainty surrounding it. The sense that something significant has begun, but remains unresolved. That decisions have been made, but not fully explained. That consequences are being felt, but not fully accounted for. That uncertainty is what fuels skepticism. And skepticism, once it takes hold, is difficult to contain. The war may have started overseas, but its most unpredictable consequences are unfolding at home. And they are only just beginning.